I would call that lucky indeed. Put all of this together and the result was only a 6 billion downgrade in the borrowing outlook. That is, before any policy measures, Rachel Reeves was forecast to be running a small current budget surplus in her key year of 2029-30 and therefore meeting her fiscal rules. No fiscal repair job required. Even after accounting for the U-turns on winter fuel payments and disability benefits since the spring, she was running only a very small deficit. This was news. So, having been handed a slightly worse than last time, but definitely better than expected forecast, what did she do? In short, she raised spending and she raised taxes. There's more spending than taxes in the next 3 years, meaning higher borrowing. After that, tax rises are larger, delivering an increase in the Chancellor's headroom from a paltry 10 billion in the March forecast to around 22 billion this time around. It was a borrow to spend budget in the short term and a combination of a tax to spend and a tax to bank it budget in the medium term. The decision to increase her headroom when she didn't strictly need to deserves credit. It means that it will require a larger shock to blow the Chancellor off course. This in turn should mean that we can expect a period of greater stability and more muted policy speculation, and we really should all hope for that. The Chancellor is also hoping to reduce policy volatility by removing the formal assessment of the fiscal rules in the spring forecast. Though the OBR will still be producing a forecast, and you won't need to be an IFS trained wonk to be able to read the spreadsheet and work out if things are still on track. Now, zooming in on spending, there were 4 big stories. The first was the decision to abolish the 2-child limit from next April onwards. That will eventually cost around £3 billion per year, benefit 560,000 families to the tune of more than £5,300 per year on average, and reduce child poverty by 450,000. The second story was on welfare more broadly. The forecast for welfare spending in 2029-30 was revised up by 16 billion. Around 9 billion of which was because of the 2-child limit and policy U-turns since the spring. The rest came from higher inflation, more unemployment, more disability claims, and other moving parts. These pressures were accommodated. The third spending story was in relation to support for children with special educational needs. SEND spending has been hurtling upwards and leading councils to accumulate eye-watering deficits as spending, which is based on legally mandated entitlements, continues to run ahead of the funding provided. New data means that the OBR now expects this spending to rise by 14% in real terms this year alone. The system is a total mess, but there was progress at the budget. Thanks to new OBR powers, we now have an official forecast for SEND pressures, where previously we had been flying blind. The other big change is that central government will, from 2028, take responsibility for funding high needs spending in full. That will take pressure off councils and should sharpen minds in Whitehall to tackle the challenges. What's needed now is for the government to first set out and then deliver on plans to reform this system. The fourth spending story is that the Chancellor pared back her spending plans for later in the Parliament. The government now claims that day-to-day spending will only rise by around 0.5% per year in real terms in both 2028-29 and 2029-30, down from around 1% per year. The lower spending will come, we're told, from efficiency savings above and beyond those built into spending plans published just back in June. This is quite a big deal. 4 billion, or 1/3 of the government's additional headroom, comes from this change. All will be revealed at the 2027 spending review. Perhaps the government really will be able to find new efficiency savings. Or maybe, when the time comes and the election looms, it will find that the spending plans are unrealistically low. Now, turning to tax. Rachel Reeves said that she didn't want to come back for more. Rachel said she wouldn't come back for more. She clearly did. Tax revenues will be £38 billion higher at the end of the forecast period in 2029-30 than it was forecast to be back in March. 16 billion of that is the underlying improvement. 22 billion is the net yield from policy measures. Now, the single biggest measure was a further 3-year freeze in personal tax thresholds between 2028 and 2031. A key feature of this measure is that no one knows how much it will raise or how big the effects will be on taxpayers. The structure of the tax system has been left to the vagaries of future inflation. Under current inflation forecasts, the fiscal drag during these years will mean around 700,000 more people paying any income tax, around 1 million more people paying a higher rate. By 2029, more than a quarter of all taxpayers are expected to be higher or additional rate taxpayers. For a basic rate taxpayer, the freeze means £220 more tax per year. For a higher rate taxpayer, it rises to £600 more per year. Now, looking beyond those freezes, there were many other tax measures. I think there are two themes. The obvious one, and the one that Chancellor was keen to point out, was that they are skewed towards people with higher income or wealth, most obviously in the mansion tax and higher income tax on savings, dividends and property. But the salary sacrifice reform and tax threshold freezes are also tilted towards the top. But I think there's another theme related to tax reform. In a number of areas, the government has identified things that it sees as a problem. That's a good start. It has announced some policies that, it could be argued, are steps towards fixing the problems. But they are baby steps, and they stop well short of anything that looks like proper tax reform. Here's what I mean. The government correctly identified that problems arise because employment income is taxed at higher rates than investment incomes. This, at least partly, motivated increased taxes on dividends, interest income and property income. What the government didn't highlight is that the tax base for these taxes, what they're actually levied on, is flawed. Because that tax base is left unchanged, this change does more damage to savings and investment incentives than is necessary. With reform to the tax base, we could have higher rates with less damage to saving and investment incentives. On property, the government correctly identified that council tax is unjustifiably regressive. It has found a way to start to change that by adding higher taxes at the top. Properties, at least high-value ones, will finally be revalued. But those new valuations won't be used for council tax. We will now have two property taxes based on different valuations. And people ask why our tax system is too complex. One reason is because it's often seen as easier to add something than to fix what we already have. Sorry, my notes have just jumped down, so let me find where I am back again. Let me jump down again. So this is just completely jumped. Okay, I think this is my notes are just jumping all over the place. Maybe I'll just switch where I'm going with this. Hang on, sorry everyone listening into this. So here's another problem that the government has identified. The long-term decline in fuel duty receipts. It has found a neat way to undo the temporary 5p cuts to fuel duty. That's to be commended, if the plan is carried through. Although it has also continued the absurd practice of freezing the permanent rate of fuel duties for another year, while saying it will rise in line with inflation in future. On the topic of driving, the government also chose to introduce a new per-mile tax on driving electric cars. Credit to them for tackling the long-deferred question of how to tax electric cars. But the main reason to have such a tax is to reflect the major cost associated with driving, congestion. What we've got is a tax per mile, whether that's a mile driven through a city centre at rush hour or an empty motorway at 2 a.m. in the morning. That's a very poor substitute for a tax that is actually linked to congestion. Baby steps. The move to cap tax breaks on salary sacrifice pension contributions was cited as a means to increase fairness. Salary sacrifice contributions are strange in that they walk and talk like employee contributions, but get the tax breaks that come with employer contributions. Capping those tax breaks is effectively moving a boundary in the tax system and adding some complexity. It's hard to see this as a principal reform to the tax treatment of pensions, not least because the government gives no indication of why it thinks there should be such a gaping tax difference between employer and employee contributions in the first place. That aside, some will also be interested to note that as a result of both this measure and the new threshold freezes, national insurance will increase. I would call that a breach of the manifesto. Before we move away from tax, changes to taxation of energy are worth a mention. There are lots of knotty details here, but let me give you the takeaway. The government said the measures it is introducing will save households £150 per year off their energy bills. While it has given some substantial tax cuts on energy bills over the next few years, the longer-term offerings are much more paltry, cutting only £39 per year off bills from 2029 onwards. Let's step back. This was undoubtedly a big budget in terms of the numbers involved. How can it not be when tax revenues are now £38 billion higher in 2029-30 than previously expected? But it's not a big budget. It's not a budget that feels particularly big on ambition, at least not relative to the scale of the challenges we face. Perhaps as an indication of that, I expect this budget will be remembered not for any of its policy measures, but for the surrounding process, which is unlike anything I have ever seen. Unprecedented levels of briefing and speculation that was bad for growth and sucked the life out of more important debates. All about a fiscal repair job that didn't exist, and all topped off by an accidental leak by the Office Budget Responsibility that allowed us to see the main shape of the budget before the Chancellor even got to her feet. This was not a budget process, to repeat. Now, I don't want to be too negative about the budget itself. There are bright spots. The increase in headroom, the plan for how to tax electric cars, more transparency on send cost. All of these decisions and some others deserve credit. And for a government aiming to reduce measured child poverty, scrapping the two-child limit is a cost-efficient means to do so. But beyond that, I can't help but feel underwhelmed. The fiscal forecasts are predicated on spending plans that would involve near heroic restraint in an election year and backloaded set of tax rises that are almost entirely delay the pain. It's reminiscent of the fiscal fictions of recent years. I hope this government is able to deliver on its plans, but I have my doubts. Bigger picture, the government said that growth was its number one mission. It was right, it should be. Before the budget, the UK was faced with lacklustre economic growth, stagnating living standards, and a dizzying array of fiscal pressures. The same is still true after this budget. The Office of Budget Responsibility forecasts that average disposable incomes will only grow by about 0.5% per year this Parliament. This is truly dismal, especially when compared to the more than 2% per year we achieved across every Parliament from the mid-80s to the mid-2000s. Growth not only makes us richer, it makes almost every problem easier to solve. At the last budget, the Chancellor said, every budget I deliver will be focused on our mission to grow the economy. That wasn't on show yesterday. It was never going to be possible to do such a large tax rise and have growth and have that be good for growth. But, and I'm fully aware that I sound like a broken record here, tax reform was the way to ensure that taxes don't do more damage than necessary. The Chancellor, like her predecessor, continues to shy away from that meaningful reform that could move the dial. This felt mostly like a budget of government trying to scrape through. Of course, no fiscal event can do everything, and reform is hard. But given the scale of the challenges we face, and given the government's lofty rhetoric about change and its ambitions on growth, I think we're entitled to ask for more. And let's all hope that now we get a period with less speculation about what the Chancellor might have to respond to next, and therefore a period in which the government can devote its bandwidth to how to tackle the challenge of boosting productivity and growth. Without higher growth, there will be plenty more tough budgets to come. But on that, let me hand over to my colleagues to tell you more of the details. You are going to first hear from Nick Ridpath, who will talk you through the public finances, then from Isaac Delestra, who will talk you through some of the tax measures, and then from Tom Waters, who will talk you through some more tax measures and some distributional analysis. Then we'll get time for your questions, so please do pop them into Slido. But for now, Nick, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Helen. So what did we learn yesterday on the public finances? I'm going to first give a sort of one-slide summary of the kind of 4 key points we learned, and then I'll go into each of them in a little bit more detail. So the first thing to note is despite the much anticipated productivity downgrade that did turn out to be relatively large, the OBR forecasts higher revenues overall in really good news for the Chancellor to help her deal with the kind of pressures we're facing. But the other problem is that these pressures were also amplified in the forecasts. Underlying on pressures on public spending coming from inflation and from send, among other things, pushed up borrowing and led to the Chancellor facing an overall downgrade to borrowing. Now, in response to this, or in policy announced at the budget, but there were both tax and spending rises announced. We had more of tax and more of spending. But the spending was relatively front-loaded, while the tax was heavily back-loaded. Overall, this leaves us in a situation with much more headroom against the fiscal rules than the Chancellor had previously. The headroom has more than doubled. This should, in the long run, make for greater stability and reduce the kind of speculation we've seen over the last year and really over the last few weeks. And this is really welcome news. So the first key point is on revenues and on the OBR's revenue forecast. And what we've seen is higher revenues forecast by the OBR. And this means, of course, on the chart, lower borrowing. This is really good news for the Chancellor. We see revenues 16 billion higher in 29-30, and that's even before we start taking into account policy measures that affect revenue, such as tax rises. But how did we get here? This isn't really what we were expecting when we came into the budget. So how did we get to this total change of revenues that's a positive 16 billion? Now, the first thing to note is that we had a productivity downgrade that really meant we thought we were going to bring down revenues. But actually, it did. The cuts to the OBR's productivity forecast, which means they now think productivity and therefore the real size of the economy will grow more slowly in the medium term, knock around 16 billion off the level of revenues we can expect by 2029-30. However, other elements, particularly kind of near-term changes to the forecast, particularly through inflation and the economy becoming more tax rich, mean that we got back up to this 16 billion increase. So on inflation, we've seen this be much higher this year, and the OBR reasonably expects that will take a while to come back down. We've also seen higher real wage growth this year. That makes the economy more tax rich. More income comes from labor and more spending comes from consumption. Both of these things are more highly taxed, and so this will increase tax revenues. Broadly, therefore, it makes sense that we might think that this higher inflation and the more tax-rich economy would mean that revenues will be higher going forward. However, it's worth noting that from the inflation and the wage growth we've already seen this year, we haven't seen that feed through into higher tax revenues this year. So the OBR is relatively reasonably assuming that these kind of inflation this kind of inflation and wage growth that we normally see will pass through into higher tax revenues, but there's a note of caution that that's not something we've actually seen in the outturn data as of yet. On the other side of the ledger, the OBR also made really significant changes in their forecast to government spending. Now, some of these things are things that are regularly updated. We saw changes in pre-measures, so before the impact of policy, changes to the expected benefit spending, mostly driven by the same higher anticipated inflation, and to debt interest spending. We've seen government gilt yields, the interest rate at which the government borrows, increase since March, and this means that the OBR expects the government will be spending more in debt interest. But we also saw other changes, in particular from SEND spending, where the OBR reclassified how they thought about it. And I'm going to go into a bit more depth about that now. So it's noteworthy in itself and welcome that the OBR is forecasting now has an explicit forecast for SEND spending, but it's also noteworthy and concerning that this forecast has it rising really rapidly. In 2025-26, so this year, they forecast that SEND spending will grow by 14% and we'll see continued high growth in the years after that. This is particularly concerning because if we look at the rate the OBR expects SEND funding to be set at, it's much lower. And what this means is that, as we've seen over the last few years, and we'll continue to see and expect to see more, we will see kind of cumulative SEND deficits at councils as they have to sort of scramble for ways to pay for this. Now, what was announced in the budget on this is that from 2028-29, all funding for SEND will come directly from central government departmental spending. Now, this may help to sort of sharpen minds in central government as to how to face this challenge. But it does mean that there's £6 billion of implied SEND spending pressure just by 2028-29 that will now fall directly on central government. There are several ways they could deal with this. Central government could slow down spending growth with reforms, with a new SEND white paper that will be coming out soon. Or they could choose to top up funding, although that will involve questions of where that funding will come from. That, however, has been kicked down the road and represents a large challenge for the 2027 spending review. So overall, what we saw were large underlying revenue increases and large underlying spending increases before we even think about the policies that Rachel Reeves has announced. Overall, this left her with a small sort of fiscal hole that, as Helen has said, wouldn't actually have needed a response to stay within her fiscal rules, but there was a downgrade to borrowing of around 6 billion. So in terms of what she did in policy, the first thing was to increase taxes with significant new tax measures. Now, my colleagues will talk more and kind of into the nitty-gritty of the kind of tax-by-tax breakdown, but from a public finance perspective, the key thing to note is that these tax rises are heavily backloaded. More than half of the tax increase is coming in 2029-30, the year in which the fiscal rules bind. To zoom out even further, we now know that this is currently forecast to be the largest tax rise in Parliament on record. And that's when we think about taxes that have sort of been announced in budget. So this is combining the tax rises from the budget last year and the tax rises from the budget this year. It's important to note that these aren't the only increases in the tax paid in Britain that we have seen over the course of the last couple of years. Things like the economy becoming more tax rich and the sort of long-run effects, the lagged effects of tax increases by the last government, particularly the threshold freezes, are also coming down the line, meaning that taxes overall have risen by more than that over the last couple of years, or are set to increase by more than that over the Parliament. On the other side again, when we think about spending, we also saw new spending measures. So we saw higher taxes and higher spending. On the spending announcements, a lot of this comes from welfare. We saw extra spending on welfare, first from ending the two-child limit, and also, although it was announced earlier, from the U-turns to disability insurance and winter fuel that were announced earlier in the summer, but were formalised in the OBR's forecast today. My colleagues will talk more a little bit about what those mean for households, but from a public finance perspective, they represent a chunky increase in spending. Now, the other thing we saw was some degree of restraint or cuts to public service spending in 2028-29 and 2029-30, a few years down the line. The idea behind this is that we'll halve real terms growth rate in day-to-day spending. But this has been framed as additional efficiency savings for the government, for the departments to find. Now, it's worth noting that 5 months ago at the spending review, we saw really ambitious plans for public sector productivity published that were going to generate a lot of efficiency savings. The government has now come back 5 months later and say they expect to find more. And these are making a sort of sizable change to the kind of overall fiscal picture. These are expected to save around 4 billion in 2029-30. That's around a third of the increase in headroom that the Chancellor has found. So this is really meaningful for how we think about headroom going forward and about the fiscal picture going forward. And it's not without risks. We've seen time and time again that governments have a clear tendency to promise future cuts, which they don't go on to deliver. And given these savings are really ambitious, it seems there's a chance we could be here again. Overall, when we look at the total change to borrowing, what that means is this is a heavily backloaded budget in saving overall. So in the first 3 years of the forecast, up to 2028-29, we see higher borrowing, but in 2029-30, we do start to see borrowing reduce relative to what was expected in March. So where does this leave us? The way I'm going to show you this is with a sort of budget in one chart. This is Rachel Reeves' headroom. It's how she's doing, how the current budget deficit is doing, and how she is doing against her primary fiscal rule. So in 2029-30, the Chancellor has to run a current budget surplus in order to meet her fiscal rule. Now, back in March, she was doing this with around 10 billion of headroom, but she was also doing this with several years to spare. So by 2027-28, she was expected to be she would have been borrowing enough to meet her fiscal rule if that was the year that binds. However, it's worth noting that 10 billion of headroom was really quite a small amount, and as I'll discuss in a minute, meant that she was exposed to all sorts of minor economic shocks that could throw her policy trajectory off course. Now we have a very different picture. We have higher borrowing in the first up until 2028-29. The current budget deficit will be higher for most of that time, and we will only start to be running a current budget surplus by 2028-29. However, in 2029-30, the year in which the fiscal rules actually bind, the Chancellor has built herself significantly more headroom, 22 billion rather than 10. And we should really expect this to reduce the probability that the Chancellor is blown around by external events that are outside of her control or forecast changes that are outside of her control. We wanted to kind of finish. We wanted to get into exactly how likely it was that she would be blown out of course and how much she's done to kind of avoid that. And the question we can ask there is, will we all be here again in the spring? Will we be facing another challenge like we were expecting in this budget? And to do that, I want to talk about something else the Chancellor announced, which is the idea that she will only change fiscal policy, only have one fiscal event per year. That means she's not expecting to make significant change to fiscal policy until next autumn. However, she has said that if the OBR forecast has a large enough negative economic shock that it provokes a response, there will be a return to an additional fiscal event or policy changes will be needed. So what I'm going to show you is the range of all the shocks we've seen, and I'm going to compare them to the kind of headroom the Chancellor has left herself, both in the past and at this budget. So in March 2025, she left herself with £10 billion of headroom. And I'm going to show you now the kind of shocks that would have meant that would have required an adjustment with that kind of headroom and those that would not have. And what we can see is a really large proportion of the shocks to the OBR forecasts would have meant the Chancellor would have needed to correct policy in order to meet them. With that kind of headroom, there's a decent chance with the kind of shocks we've seen in the past that we might have been back here in the spring. The Chancellor has now increased headroom to 22 billion, and what we can see is actually a large proportion of those shocks would no longer blow her off course or would no longer necessitate a response to stay within her fiscal rules. So this is really welcome. This means that effectively we are more likely to we're less likely, the Chancellor is less likely to be kind of forced into another fiscal event, and this should reduce kind of speculation leading up to future forecasts. So the conclusion, in short, what we saw was higher underlying revenues in the forecast, higher spending pressures in the forecast. And this was topped up with higher taxes in policy and higher spending in policy. And overall, what this means, because of the backloaded nature of it, is that we have more borrowing in the next 3 years and less after. Now, there are some commendable decisions in this. First of all, it's more than doubled headroom. This should reduce the sensitivity of policy to forecast changes. In addition, the more transparent treatment of send pressures is really welcome. It was not good for us to be kind of overshooting borrowing consistently when we all knew that the send costs were rising. But there are also some risks to deliverability. These tax increases are highly backloaded, and it's worth noting are mostly set to kick in what will likely be an election year, while departmental spending is now even more front-loaded, leaving clear pressures down the line and in particular decisions for the 2027 spending review. Meanwhile, it's worth noting that this 1/3 of the increase in headroom that we do think is good comes from these efficiency savings that are very ambitious, and that should tempt that, and there are risks to how deliverable those will be. With that, I'm going to pass on to Isaac to talk you through some tax measures.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Oh, sorry, there's an appendix.
Oh, I will flick through the appendix, which viewers can peruse at their leisure at a later time. Okay, so I'm going to be talking now a little bit about indirect taxation and capital taxation in yesterday's budget. And broadly speaking, I'm going to cover three things. So I'm going to start off by talking about changes to taxes on saving and investment in the budget. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the so-called mansion tax that was imposed. And then finally, I'm going to talk about indirect taxation, that's taxes on goods and services, and environmental taxation. So let's start with taxes on saving and investment, and let's dive straight in at the deep end with changes to the taxation of salary, sacrifice, pensions. Now, just in case anyone isn't completely up to date, I thought I would provide a quick reminder of how pension contributions are treated for the purposes of national insurance contributions, or NICs. Now, withdrawals from pensions are always free of NICs. It's only contributions that are ever taxed. And when it comes to employee pension contributions, those incur both employee and employer NICs. Employer pension contributions, on the other hand, don't incur either of those. They're completely untaxed when it comes to NICs. And what that means is that employer pension contributions are more likely taxed. It's a more attractive way to make contributions to your pension. And one way in which people respond to that is through coming up with salary sacrifice arrangements. Now, about 1/3 of employees who contribute to a pension are in one of these arrangements. And what it basically means is that an employee sacrifices part of their salary, and in return, the employer makes a NICs-free pension contribution on their behalf. Now, in some ways, salary sacrifice is a bit of a strange, sort of anomalous part of the system. It's quite convoluted. And the Chancellor has taken steps to reduce its generosity in yesterday's budget. It's not a tax break that's available to everyone. In fact, a lot of whether you get it or not depends just on whether your employer happens to offer it. Fundamentally, though, salary sacrifice isn't the core anomaly here. It's a symptom rather than a cause of what's going on. The fundamental anomaly here is the big difference in tax treatment between employee and employer pension contributions. And just worth bearing in mind, that's not something that changed at all in yesterday's budget. It's really just a shifting of this boundary slightly in one direction rather than fundamentally addressing these differences. So with that in mind, what actually happened at yesterday's budget? Well, the budget capped these salary sacrifice contributions at £2,000 a year. And that's going to raise about £2.5 billion. Now, because employee national insurance contributions are charged at a main rate of 8% and then a higher rate of 2%, it's actually the case that for those earning below £50,000, the tax increase is bigger than for those earning above £50,000. Nevertheless, most of these contributions and most of the people affected by the tax are going to be people with higher earnings. About a third of total affected contributions are made by those earning over £100,000. So how would we expect people to respond to these tax changes? Well, one way in which we might expect them to respond is they'll just contribute less to their pension because it's now more heavily taxed. We might also see a shift towards ordinary employer contributions. So contracts may adjust in the market so that employers start offering maybe slightly lower salaries, but higher pension contributions. That wouldn't be salary sacrifice, but it might in effect have a look quite similar. And finally, this is ultimately an increase in NICs. And so we'd expect it to see a reduction in total work done, both because people are now being taxed more heavily on their work and because people are more expensive to employ. Okay, so a second sizable change that happened at yesterday's budget was an increase to all rates, apart from the additional rate of dividend tax, to income tax for dividends, property, and interest income. Now, that raises about £2.5 billion, and it will predominantly be coming from the well-off, although not exclusively so. Particularly for the tax increase on rental income, for instance, some of that is going to be passed through in higher rents. Certainly, tenants paying those higher rents aren't going to be that well off. Now, as Helen mentioned in her opening statement, the Chancellor has identified a real problem here, which is that capital incomes in general tend to be taxed at lower rates than labour incomes for employees. And this move does narrow that gap to some extent, although worth noting it does also open up some other gaps. However, fundamentally, the problem we have with our system is that we have a poorly designed tax base for capital income. So what we're actually taxing isn't really the right thing. And what that means is that because the Chancellor's just tweaked rates rather than grappling with more fundamental reform, she's left with a bit of a trade-off that, yes, she's managed to narrow some of those gaps, but she's going to do so at the cost of exacerbating distortions to saving and investment, which is what we'd expect these changes to do. Now, there were also a few other changes to the taxation of savings. I'm not going to go into these in detail. Some of them are quite sensible, like the reduction in CGT relief for employee ownership trusts. Some of them are much less sensible, like the changes we saw to ISAs. We can talk about those more in the Q&A if people are particularly interested. The next thing I want to talk about is the high value council tax surcharge, which some people are more colloquially calling the mansion tax. This is its official name. Now, this is going to be a new tax, and it's on properties worth more than £2 million as of 2026, and it'll be levied from April 2028. Now, there's going to be 4 bands, and if you're in the lowest band, you'll pay £2,500 a year. If you're in the highest band, you'll pay £7,500 a year. And overall, even though this has caused quite a lot of fuss, it doesn't actually raise that much revenue. And while the individual tax rises are high for those who are affected, there aren't that many properties that are being taxed, so it only raises about £500 million. What will the effect of the tax be? Well, HMRC at least is assuming that basically this all feeds through into reducing the price of the taxed properties. In terms of who we think will actually be paying this tax, well, we don't actually have good data on the real-time value of all properties in the UK, but what we do have is data going back over the last few years on the price at which properties were sold. And if we look at that data, what we find is that about a quarter of the properties sold for over £2 million, so the kind of properties we might expect to be subject to this tax, are in just 3 boroughs of London: Kensington and Chelsea, Westminster and Camden, and about 70% of those properties are in London and the South East. So a very geographically concentrated tax base for this new tax. Now, council tax, at least before discounts, is, as Helen said in her opening statements, regressive with respect to property value. So people who live in more valuable houses actually pay a lower share of their property value every year than people in more modest homes. So there is at least a certain logic to increasing tax on high value properties. And if you want to increase tax on those with a high amount of wealth, then taxing property is probably one of the least economic damaging ways to do that. But fundamentally, the issue here is that council tax, which is paid by, which still applies to all properties, is still absurdly based on 1991 property values. That hasn't changed. That isn't being reformed. Basically, what we saw yesterday is a bolt-on to the existing, desperately in need of reform council tax system that essentially just makes the current system even more complicated. This is really not fundamental reform. So finally, I'm going to talk about indirect taxation. So that's taxation on goods and services. Now, one of the things we saw quite a lot of changes to in the budget is how we tax motoring. And probably the most eye-catching change was a new 3p per mile tax on electric cars that will come into force in April 2028. Now, that raises about £2 billion in 2030, although in the long term, it's going to raise quite a lot more as electric vehicle adoption increases. So by the time all cars are electric, the OBR estimate it'll be raising about £7 billion a year in today's terms. So in the long run, this is actually the second biggest tax raising measure in yesterday's budget, just after the threshold freezes, which Tom will be talking to you about in the next presentation. And some of that revenue will go some way to offsetting the lost revenue from fuel duty. So when we transition fully to electric cars, there won't be any more revenue from fuel duty. Now, one effect you might expect this policy to have is that maybe it would reduce the take-up of electric cars, seeing as they're now being more heavily taxed. One factor weighing against that, however, is that the government has in place something called the Zero Emissions Vehicle Mandate. And what that actually means is that the share of electric cars sold as a share of total cars can't fall. That's mandated for the sellers of cars. What that means then is that insofar as this policy does reduce demand for electric cars, the market will have to adjust in order to keep those shares of electric cars sold constant. So pretty counterintuitively, we're seeing a tax on electric cars, which ultimately we would expect to increase the price of petrol and diesel vehicles. Now, one question you might ask is, okay, we're going to lose this revenue from fuel duty. Why do we need to recoup it through taxing electric cars? Can't we just get it through income tax or VAT or some other source? Well, there is one really good argument for having a tax on motoring, and that's that it imposes significant costs on the rest of society, largely on other road users. Now, these are government figures that estimate the breakdown of those costs imposed on society. And as you can see, the vast majority of those costs are in the form of congestion. Now, you also have other costs, accidents, greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, you won't have those for electric cars. And then a small residual category. Worth just pausing here for a second to note that Rachel Reeves made quite a lot of fuss about this being a tax aimed at compensating for the fact that electric vehicles wear out roads, that there's wear and tear to roads as a result of driving electric vehicles. That's actually a cost that is a subset of that tiny little blue sliver. So it's really not a very good justification for having a tax like this. If you're going to tax driving electric vehicles, it should be for correcting something like congestion or accidents. Road wear and tear really isn't a reasonable rationale for this kind of tax. Now, what I'm showing you on this chart is the cost of congestion by miles driven. And this is a little bit complicated, but the main point I want you to take from this chart is just that a lot of the cost of congestion really comes from a very small number of journeys. About 50% of congestion costs are accounted for by just 3% of miles driven. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it, right? If you're driving down a country lane for many miles, you're not going to impose congestion costs on people. If you're stuck in traffic in central London, you might not travel very far, but you're going to impose a lot of congestion costs. Now, yesterday's tax is just taxed at a flat rate. And that means that it isn't really related at all to this congestion externality. And that means it doesn't really do a very good job of correcting for the costs of congestion in the way that we might want this kind of tax to do. So the government does deserve some credit here. Governments have prevaricated on this issue of how electric vehicles are going to be taxed for quite a long time. They at least have a plan. And although current design isn't perfect, it will be easier to do this now than it would have been if they'd left it even further into the future when more and more people have electric cars. But a congestion-based tax really would have been a much better option. I now want to talk a bit about energy bills. So there are quite a few changes to how electricity suppliers and energy bill suppliers are taxed in the budget. There were two small changes which are permanent that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. One, you'd expect to increase prices of energy. One, you'd expect to reduce. Overall, you'd expect those two to still be reducing energy bills. The big ticket item, though, was a temporary reduction in the tax paid by electricity suppliers through something called the Renewable Obligation Levy. Now, basically what's going to happen is that a portion of that tax that's currently paid by electricity suppliers is going to be paid instead through central government taxation, and we'd expect some of that to feed through into lower bills for consumers. But that's only going to be in place for 3 years. It's a temporary measure, and then it's going to come to an end. What does that mean for energy bills? Well, the combined impact of those three policies on average annual energy bills for the first 3 years, that temporary period while the big policy's in place, is going to be about £131, so a pretty substantial reduction. But after the renewables obligation reduction expires, it's going to fall to just £39, so much more modest in the long term. Now, one sort of fun fact here is that you'd expect lower prices of electricity to lead to more consumption of electricity. And so you might worry that that's going to lead to more emissions as a result of more electricity consumption, but that actually won't be the case. And that's because electricity generation comes under the UK Emissions Trading Scheme, which caps total emissions across a group of sectors, including electricity. So when you get increased demand for electricity, what that's going to effectively do is push up prices and reduce emissions from flights, energy-intensive industries and other areas. So we've got a reduction in tax on energy bills that may lead to an increase in the price of flights. Again, not the most intuitive outcome. Now, there have been a whole bunch of other changes to indirect taxation. I'm not going to go into these in detail, just to say that, as Helen mentioned, really were a lot of tax changes in this budget. This really wasn't a budget that gave a recipe for stability and simplicity in the tax system. So just a few conclusions. One real theme of yesterday's budget was that across a range of measures, we increased taxation, or we saw taxation increase on saving and investment, and that will weaken incentives to save and invest. Now, there were a few little glimmers of reform there. It was the case that we finally have a plan for how electric vehicles are going to be taxed, for instance. But really, all too often, the story of yesterday's budget was sticking plaster solutions that treated the symptoms rather than the underlying causes of the UK tax system's growing malaise. We have capital income tax rates that increased, but without any real attempt to reform the tax base. That is what we're actually taxing, which means we're going to get distortions to saving and investment. We saw a salary sacrifice change that tweaked the boundary, but didn't deal with the fundamental gulf between how employee and employer contributions are taxed. And we saw a change to council tax that bolted on a little change for the most valuable properties, but left the vast majority of council tax completely unchanged. In fact, we now have a more complex system than we did before. And we had a tax on electric cars that, while it's laudable the government's looking to tackle this issue, really doesn't target congestion externalities well at all. So that's going to be all from me. I'm now going to hand over to Tom, who's going to talk about a few more tax measures and also about some of the benefit measures in the budget.
Thank you very much, Isaac. Yes, so there's one key tax measure that Isaac didn't cover. I'm going to talk about that and the important welfare measure we heard about as well. And in the tax world, the most important measure in revenue terms was, of course, the freeze to tax thresholds. So the context here is that almost all major personal tax thresholds have been frozen since at least the middle of 2022. In real terms, that implies a tax rise. Now, previously, the existing plans had been to go back to normal inflation at rating in April 2028. Yesterday, we learnt that the Chancellor has pushed that back to April 2031. So that's a 3-year extension to the tax freeze. So what does this do to tax liabilities? So what I'm showing you here is on the horizontal axis is employee earnings, and on the vertical axis is the increase in tax resulting from yesterday's announcement. And basically the message to take away here is the extra tax you see depends on where in the income tax schedule you are. Basic rate taxpayers will see a £220 tax rise, higher rate taxpayers £600, and a little bit less for additional rate taxpayers. Now, taking the freeze as a whole, by 2030, the beginning of the next decade, we are set to see 5 million more people paying income tax than there would have been if there had been no freeze. 700,000 of those are coming in the last 3 years of the freeze, so the extension that we heard about yesterday. A further 5 million are set to pay higher rate tax, that's the 40% rate. 1 million of those are coming in that last 3 years. And let's look now at how this changes the shape of the tax system. So what I'm showing you here is the distribution of employee earnings over time. And then I'm overlaying here what the higher rate threshold, the point at which you start paying 40% tax, what that would have been had there been no freeze, had the high rate threshold just gone up with CPI. And you can see it bobbing around a little bit under the 90th percentile of employee earnings. That means that about 10%, a little bit more than 10% of employees paying higher rate tax. Now, the existing freeze meant that the higher rate threshold was already due to decline quite a bit in real terms. Once you add on the 3-year extension that we found out about yesterday, it actually goes a little below the 75th percentile of employee earnings. And so what that means is a quarter of employees are set to pay higher rate tax. Now, of course, the point of this tax rise is to raise revenue, and raise revenue it does. Given the inflation forecast, it's expected to raise £13 billion by the beginning of the next decade. But of course, this is based on inflation forecasts between 3 and 5 years from now. Those are very difficult to predict. Wouldn't be at all surprising if things didn't turn out exactly as the OBR expect right now. And based on previous differences between forecast and outturn inflation, speaking roughly, we'd expect about a 1 in 4 chance that the reform would end up raising more than £21 billion. That's if inflation turns out higher than expected. And a 1 in 4 chance that it would raise less than £8 billion if inflation turns out less than expected. And so you can see that the yield from this reform is in fact quite uncertain. Okay, with that in mind, let's head now to the major welfare reform that we learned about yesterday, and that was the scrapping of the 2-child limit. So a quick primer on the 2-child limit. This is in universal credit, the main means-tested benefit for working-age families. Universal credit claimants usually get an extra £3,500 per year for each child, but they don't get that extra cash for third and subsequent children born after April 2017. So this is the 2-child limit. The Chancellor announced that this is going to be scrapped this coming April. That increases benefits for a bit over 500,000 families in 2029 at a cost of about £3 billion. And the government estimates that it will reduce child poverty by about 450,000 or 3%. That number looks about right to us. It's a measure that's well targeted at reducing headline poverty. That's because poverty amongst children in larger families is about 44%, quite a bit higher than poverty amongst children in smaller families at 24%. However, it's much less well targeted at dealing with deep poverty. So there's about 140,000 children who are in particularly poor families who are affected by a separate benefit cap as well. And so when the 2-child limit is scrapped, they actually won't gain anything at all. Let's look now to how the budget reforms affect richer and poorer households. So here I'm showing you richer households on the right, poorer households on the left. I'm showing you the impact of budget reforms next year. Now, it's not possible to model everything here. I'm here just showing you some of the key policies. And so in particular, this graph is showing you the impact of abolishing the 2-child limit and a cut relative to existing plans in fuel duty. You can see it's an increase in incomes, particularly at the bottom of the income distribution. That's coming from the abolition of the 2-child limit. But now if I zip forward to 2030, you can see the picture changes quite a bit. So this most importantly incorporates the tax threshold freeze, and you can see it implies quite a lot larger declines in income towards the middle and top of the income distribution. Now, what isn't shown here is a higher tax on savings, dividend, and property income, and the restrictions on salary sacrifice, things that we were just hearing about from Isaac. Those are takeaways, and they're takeaways that are targeted towards the top of the income distribution. Also not shown here is the ending of an energy levy. That's a giveaway that's sort of fairly flat across the income distribution, and an expanded warm homes discount that basically is a takeaway from higher income households and a giveaway to lower income households. And essentially, if we incorporated all of these policies as well, it would only make these yellow bars here look sharper still. So larger giveaways at the bottom of the income distribution and takeaways at the top. But the basic message to go away with is that what we're seeing here is similar to what we saw in the public finances, where the Chancellor is loosening things in the short run in order to tighten in the long run. Similarly here, we're seeing a giveaway next year in the short run, but that will be compensated by a takeaway in the longer run through higher taxation for middle and particularly higher income households. Now, moving away from these individual reforms, an important part of the bigger picture is that the OBR has downgraded productivity. That means lower real GDP per capita. And when you add that together with significant rises in tax, and despite some high-profile giveaways, real household disposable income growth remains really pretty poor. Here I'm showing you annualized real household disposable income growth per capita over different parliaments. And you can see the forecast for this parliament is one of the weakest in recent decades, beaten only by last parliament. So to conclude, we've been looking at two of the highest profile policy decisions, and in many ways, they couldn't be more different from one another. One of them is a big, broad-based, but somewhat uncertain tax rise. And another is a much smaller policy. It's a targeted benefit rise going to a small number of households. And of course, these decisions matter, but in the long run, the key to living standards growth will be found in rising productivity. I think it's fair to say there's more to be done there. I'll hand back now to Helen to take some of your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick, Isaac and Tom. And let me use this opportunity to say a really big thank you to all of the other colleagues who have worked behind the scenes, many of them actually literally overnight without going to bed to put this analysis together. So thank you very much. It's now time to come to your questions. There are already lots of questions on Slido. Please do keep adding your questions and voting for the ones that you would most like to know the answer to. We have lots of my other wonderful colleagues online on the call. So I'm going to bring them in for some other questions. And I'm going to start with a whole set of questions about special educational needs. There are lots of questions on this theme, so let's take a few of them together. And perhaps I'll start by asking Luke Sibieta to pop in and answer some of these, but I might call some other colleagues too. So the set of questions are basically around what is happening, why is it rising, and what does it mean for other education spending? So Luke, let's start, if we can, with give us a sketch of why is special educational needs and disability spending rising?
Well, we could spend quite a long seminar on this, but I think let's try and keep it as brief as possible. So, predominantly, there are three main things that are happening. First, there's a really rapid rise in the number of pupils with high cost special educational needs, those who are entitled to education, health and care plans. So those plans set out the provision that pupils are expected to have and put statutory duties on councils to provide it. So there's kind of an automatic escalator happening because of the rising numbers of pupils. Secondly, there's also been capacity constraints, and that's because supply hasn't increased in line with demand. And that's meant, for example, that, say, a pupil who needs a special school place and there aren't enough state-funded special school places, the government then has to go looking in the independent sector. And places in the independent sector are about £65,000 per head, compared with about £25,000 per head in the state sector. So that naturally pushes up costs. The third is kind of more nuanced, is that there isn't really much of a value for money test in the system about whether the provision is meeting children's needs. And that's resulted in a system that provides lots of extra spending, but really patchy levels of quality.
Great. Another question that maybe we'll start with you, Luke, maybe others can jump in if they want to, is basically there's lots of questions of the same ilk, which is there a risk to frontline education spending? Now the government is bringing this in central government budgets. Will this basically mean more spending for special education needs at the expense of other educational budgets? Maybe walk us through what we think we do and don't know about the government plans here.
Well, so the government has said that provision for special educational needs will be funded from total government spending from 28-29. Now that's already meant to happen. So what's actually changed is a bit mysterious, but basically, it means that the government is taking responsibility for the projected 6 billion funding gap that's expected to be there in place in 28-29 and we learned that because of these really helpful OBR forecasts. The government now essentially faces a set of choices about how to fill that gap. The first thing it could do is try to slow the growth in spending on special educational needs. Given that's grown by about 14% in real terms, that seems like a natural first priority for government, and one that I'm sure the government will be seeking to tackle as part of its white paper expected for the autumn, for the new year. It's been kicked down the road a couple of times. Secondly, it could top up the schools budget, so that the Department for Education has more money to spend on schools, so that it can spend more money on high needs. The third option it could do is to reduce mainstream school spending to pay for higher needs funding. Now, those two last choices are difficult things to do. So to exemplify what it would mean, 6 billion is equivalent to around 9% of the overall schools budget. So that would be a really big top up. 6 billion is about 11-12% of the overall mainstream schools budget. So raiding the mainstream schools budget to pay for high needs funding would have really quite serious implications as well. So the government faces three choices: slow the growth in spending, top up the schools budget, or reduce mainstream school funding.
Brilliant, thank
If I
you.
might come in there briefly as well, Helen, and just say that obviously one of the things we haven't heard about in the budget is what's going to happen to the existing deficits that councils have incurred so far for high needs funding, and they're expected to still continue to incur over the next 3 years. And I think here the government needs to think quite carefully about the incentives it creates for local government, because as it stands, local government are sort of basically borrowing or kind of holding this money outside their sort of main accounts, these deficits they're running up. Now, if in 2028 the government says, well, look, from that point on, we're going to write off the deficits you've incurred, in effect, that removes the incentive for local government to control the spending in the short term. So I think we expect to hear a bit more in the local government finance settlement in about a month's time, or 3 weeks' time, what the government's plans are for the existing deficits. But in designing that, it needs to make sure it dovetails with its plans for reform of SEND and its plans to centralise sort of responsibility for funding these. Otherwise, you could find that in the short term, councils just say, well, look, no, in the long term, government's paying for this and they're going to write off our debts. Why do we kind of like have to do the difficult choice of actually working out the kind of like the line here? So I think there is a real issue about making sure that the incentives for local government to make sure they're delivering on their statutory duties for sure, but also that they can controlling spending also in place.
Great, all of which speaks obviously to needing real serious reform of this area. Right, let's move on some questions. Ben, I'm going to bring you in on this. So Ben Zaranko, I'm going to ask the questions too. So a set of questions about spending pressures. Suping Chang from Telegraph asks, what are the main pressures down the road not addressed by this budget, and how big are they in pounds billion terms? Will Rachel Reeves have to come back for more? Part of that is it about SEND pushing up on those pressures? Ben?
Well, one quite simple way to think about it is that some of the pressures highlighted and discussed in the budget might turn out even bigger. So there was an upwards revision in the path for disability caseloads, for example, that could go even higher. We've just talked a lot about SEND, that could go even higher. Asylum costs is now an expectation that's going to cost a lot more to house asylum seekers than had previously been expected. Maybe that will go even higher. So there's those things. I think there's a set of challenges around public service delivery where in a world with slightly higher inflation, with squeezed budgets and cost pressures all over the place, can they still deliver on what the government is wanting them to deliver on? If NHS waiting lists stop falling, for example, will there be pressure there? Additional costs on the NHS are always an issue. At the moment in particular, there's worry about costs on drug prices, public sector pay across the board more generally. You've seen strikes in the NHS at the moment. I think keeping public sector unions happy in a world where departmental budgets are growing only slightly faster than inflation, allowing for, if you look in the belly of the OBR forecast, it assumes that there'll be about 2% nominal pay awards for public sector workers in the medium term. That's not loads if you're looking to restore pay. So I think there's spending pressures all over the place. There's the big promise to increase defense spending as a share of GDP as part of our NATO commitments. All of those aren't really new, and we don't know which ones will crystallize. But those are all risks to the forecasts. And looking at the last 5 years, we know that spending does have a habit of turning out higher than the government might like.
Yeah, and of course the Chancellor has got some more headroom, so she could weather some more shocks to spending. But I think it is right that there's more upside risk in some of those spending pressures. While we have you, Ben, Richard Partington from The Guardian asks, could credible savings be found on public spending? How much in billions terms? Or are pressures such that the Chancellor would struggle to deliver meaningful savings? And on the flip side, has pre-election austerity been baked in? So could she find spending cuts?
Yes, the government could find spending cuts if it wanted to. It's already penciled in some cuts relative to previous plans in this budget, including for one of the years covered by the spending review. Those are largely being framed as efficiency savings that have been uncovered since the big exercise in the summer when they were on the hunt for efficiency savings. These are extra ones. The intention is that they won't affect the quality of provision of services. Let's hope so. I'm sure the public sector does have scope to become more efficient. Maybe that will turn out. But I think that more generally, if you want to make serious cuts to public spending, and this goes for reform, this goes for the Conservatives as well, we need to be thinking about what it is that we want the state to stop doing, what it is we want to start charging for, what it is we want to means test. We want to be specific about things rather than just waving our magic wand and hoping the savings will materialize. In terms of pre-election austerity, well, spending will still be growing overall on public services, just be growing really quite slowly towards the back end of this decade. And if you look, we added a nice piece of analysis on this as well. Once you build in the fact that we think the NHS will get more money, protecting the NHS has been a central part of this budget narrative as well. More money for defence as part of that NATO commitment. Once you build in all these extra things, send the aid, the promise to keep spending the same share of national income on aid, everything else, the usual suspects, the police, the prisons, the local government, HMRC, job centres, all that stuff is facing real terms year-on-year cuts. Now, whether that's austerity or not, there's no single definition on which everyone agrees, but that does look like a difficult pre-election period for the court system, for instance. So if that comes to pass, that'll be tricky.
Yeah, I think backing up, it is worth emphasising that the point that you made, Ben, that cutting spending would not be easy, but it's certainly not impossible. A government who wanted to cut back spending would have lots of choices on how to do that. Okay, let's go to the top question here, who is from Torsten, or I suspect not Torsten Bell, saying, do you agree with the Resolution Foundation that I'll ask you this too, Tom, that millions of workers would have been better off if their income tax rates had risen rather than their thresholds being frozen? So no idea what the Resolution Foundation numbers are, but question there really about how income tax rate rises would compare to threshold freezes.
Yes, you saw in my slides that if you freeze thresholds, it's a cash tax increase. It's £220 to the basic rate taxpayer, £600 high rate taxpayer. If you increase rates, then it's the amount of extra tax you pay grows with your income. That does mean certainly there would be workers who would be better off under a rate rise. There'd be other workers who, of course, would be worse off. It is, broadly speaking, it is a more progressive rise if you want to use rates rather than to use thresholds. I mean, I'd say in bigger picture terms, it's part of the overall decision the government makes when they decide how redistributive do they want the tax and benefit system to be. So I don't think in that sense that there's a kind of a clean right or wrong answer. I suppose it is true that the government felt more constrained here in the sense that they had quite explicitly ruled out increasing income tax rates in the manifesto, and so perhaps they were choosing out of necessity rather than out of the way they really think the tax system ought to look.
Great. So another question here from Ali Line at City AM saying, given the extent to which the Chancellor chose to backload tax hikes to the end of the Parliament, close to an election year, how likely do you think it is that they will be introduced in full? Perhaps I'll take that one first. I mean, one thing worth saying is that they could put them in full, and some of them will be easier to do than others. So the threshold freeze has tended to be a way that chancellors have increased taxes a lot with actually very little rumbling, partly because it is pretty stealthy. There's no day in which pay slips show a big tax rise. So that might be one that actually they don't have to do anything for it to happen. It will just happen. Some of the other ones, new tax on electric cars, salary sacrifice, maybe that would be harder to bring in near an election, and harder if you're also trying to pare back spending. So not impossible, but harder to do. There's other questions here, Isaac. I'll ask you some of these. I mean, unsurprisingly, given we made a big play on how important reform is, the questions are all of the format. So why don't governments do it? If it's so good, so why do successive governments flat out refuse to reform taxes when it's clearly needed? Do they understand? Do they not understand? Do they fear voter backlash or their jobs, or do they just cruise along, taking the path of least resistance? There's another question that I can't now find, but that was basically of the form: what's so good about tax reform? Why bother doing it? Would there be any losers? Isaac.
Well, look, I think the answer to that falls into a few different buckets. So one bucket is that I think sometimes government does genuinely misdiagnose the problem. So I think there is an issue with these higher rates of tax on capital incomes, for instance, where I think the government's rightly seen that, okay, those rates are quite a lot lower than they are on employee incomes, and there's a gap there and they want to narrow it. But you really need to take a slightly wider view and realize that if you're just going to try and solve this one little micro problem by making a tweak without taking a broader view of the overall effect the tax system is having, you're going to end up in this, horrible cycle where, okay, you fix one problem, but you make another one worse. I do think there is also just another big problem, and you see this, council tax is a great example of this, that whenever you try and update a tax, when you try and reform it, there are going to be a lot of winners as well as there are going to be a lot of losers as well as winners, and those people who lose out, even if they're a smaller group, tend to be pretty vocal. So it's clearly insane that we have a council tax system that's based on what your house was worth, 1991. I don't think anyone would think that's a sensible system. But if you update it to the most recent property values, there are going to be some people whose houses have grown more in value than others, and they're going to end up paying more tax. And in general, I think people just tend to react worse to changes than they do to an unfair status quo. But I do think we should all try and really focus on the fact that just because something has been in place for a long time doesn't mean it's a good system. Often it can have lots of unfairnesses and inefficiencies embedded in it. And I really do think that it's a shame that the government hasn't taken this opportunity to undertake more fundamental reform rather than these little sort of fiddly changes around the edge.
I think the one-line summary of that is I think we spend too much time focusing on the losers rather than who's losing from the current system. And actually, we should think about the winners from tax reform. There's a question here that I'm going to ask because I know it's going to be Stuart's going to love it. So I'm going to bring in Stuart Adam a bit on this theme of tax reform. Stuart, why don't you, and it's true for me too, why don't we like the change to cash ISAs? My team are laughing because they know that Stuart's going to love this question. You're welcome, Stuart.
Yes, thank you. Broadly speaking, because we don't want to discourage people from saving and investing. And Isaac was discussing in the context of changes to things like dividend taxation, property taxation, that there is a trade-off that on the one hand, we don't want to discourage saving and investment, but on the other hand, people that make very big returns on those investments because perhaps they get lucky, or because they have access to scarce opportunities, or because essentially it's really a return to their labor, that even though it comes in the form of capital income, we want to tax those very high returns. If you're just putting money in the bank or in a cash ISA, you're not making lots of excess returns because you're dressing up your labor as capital or anything like that. You're just converting money today into money tomorrow. And I don't see why people should be penalised for doing that. It's neither fair nor economically efficient. And so what I would like to see happen is that people who just make the kinds of returns you can make in a cash ISA or in a bank account can get that tax-free. And so I would like to just have, bank accounts and cash ISAs essentially unlimited tax-free, but tax those kinds of assets where you can make higher returns than that. We tax those kinds of excess returns. So the short answer is because all you're doing by people for saving money in cash is penalising them for saving, for wanting to spend their money tomorrow rather than today. I don't want people to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Nick, there's a factual question here that we can just do really quickly. It's can you confirm what you mean by the economy becoming more tax rich? And this is important because it's a big part of the story as to why Rachel Reeves had a much better outcome than she expected.
Yes. So what we've seen this year and last year, and this is relative to what the OBR were forecasting previously, was that real wage growth is going to be higher than they were expecting. They had pretty low expectations before, but now they have revised those upwards. That kind of means two things for the whole economy. One is that more of the economy is more of income is coming from labor. So broadly, without the economy growing anymore, if you have higher wage growth, you're seeing higher labor incomes. We tax labor more heavily than we tax other parts of the other types of income, and so more labor income as a proportion of the economy means we'll have higher revenue. Means the government will get higher revenues. Also, broadly, if you have higher wage growth rather than sort of corporate profits or something, the kind of expenditure that households do with that wage growth is consumption is more likely to be consumption rather than investment. That's something we charge VAT on, so that also is kind of more tax rich. And that means both our consumption and our incomes, our expenditure and our incomes as a sort of economy are larger. So that's kind of the basis of it.
Great. So another question, I'll come to you as well, not on Nick. Different type of question. The Chancellor announced the OBR will, incidentally, it's not about tax rich. The Chancellor announced the OBR will only be required to assess compliance with the fiscal rules once per year rather than twice. However, the OBR will still be required to produce 2 forecasts annually. Is this significant?
So it's a little bit of a weird one. I think it's got to be taken in the context of the other things the Chancellor has done today. So if the Chancellor had left herself a really minimal amount of headroom and said this, I think we'd all be saying, okay, but if the OBR puts out a forecast in 6 months' time and that says you're missing your headroom, even if it says the current budget surplus is you've got a current budget deficit in 29-30 or whatever, so that means the headroom is everyone will be able to work it out. I don't think she'd be able to get away with it. I suspect what that would mean is it wouldn't really be a credible claim. I think it's likely that you would expect with this forecast that there would be some kind of policy correction. However, with the much larger headroom she's now got, it seems to me plausible. I think it's more than likely, based on the kind of shocks we're likely to see, that we probably won't be seeing sort of big policy changes in the spring now, because it's unlikely that we're going to see an economic shock that will be large enough to blow her off course.
Yeah. I think in my mind, it's significant in the sense that it's a change to the fiscal architecture. This is a change to how we have done things. And if it means less policy tweaking, that could be good. But I don't think it really answers the question at what point Rachel Reeves would do something in that second forecast. Okay, there's more questions. So Ben, maybe I'll bring you in on a question here basically about markets. So if there's a credibility gap on whether the government can deliver this spending restraint and tax rises, is that going to feed through into bond markets? Does the Chancellor have breathing space for the spending review to set out more detail? I mean, markets so far fairly relaxed, Ben.
Right. It doesn't look like the market seemed to basically shrug, to be honest, if you look what happened to yields yesterday. And I think that's because they've been led to expect there'll be a big increase in headroom. There was a big increase in headroom. There was extra borrowing going on over the next few years, but that's not, for the most part, feeding through to a higher net cash requirement. So it's not leading to higher levels of bond issuance, meaning that gilt traders don't have to readjust their plans very much, readjust their pricing expectations. So it basically wasn't much of a surprise. And I think that's why it was met with a very muted response. Looking forwards, as people crunch through the detail and start thinking about what's likely over the next few years, the path for future borrowing and for future bond issuance, they may start to worry that some of this won't be deliverable. Maybe some of that will be baked into pricing, but there's no sharp adjustment here. I think it was broadly viewed as a sensible enough package. I think there are some doubts about deliverability, but not large enough to lead to any sort of market turbulence, I don't think.
Yeah, and the government will clearly be pleased that rates haven't gone up as a result. Stuart, I'm going to turn to you next for a question related to housing. So Harriet Lyon at Daily Mail asks, what impact do you think the mansion tax will have on the housing market?
Well, I think the main effect it'll have will be to reduce the prices of those properties that are subject to the tax. And HMRC and the OBR assume, forecast, whatever you want to call it, that the extra tax that's due on these will be reflected fully in property prices. So property prices will fall by the essentially expected stream of tax payments due to be paid on those properties. And I think that's pretty much right. I would expect property values to fall by that amount. I think there's been quite a bit of talk about this leading to a big fall in transactions and so on. I mean, ultimately, if everyone knew what the valuation effects were going to be, there's actually no particular reason this should lead to any change in sales, or who buys and sells which properties. I think what might do that, though, is uncertainty around valuations, and particularly for properties that look like they may be around the thresholds between the different bands. Then there is a risk that the uncertainty about what tax liability is going to go with that property means that sales of those kinds of properties around the thresholds slow down in the run-up to the introduction of the tax. I think that should be a temporary effect. I'm not sure it would necessarily be a huge effect. I think it's likely to be kind of localized around the thresholds, but I think there will be some effect of that, and I think that's one disadvantage actually of the kind of banded structure that the government's chosen for the new council tax surcharge, that it's not just a proportion of value, but there are big jumps in liability across the different band thresholds. And so if you're not sure which band a property is going to end up being in, you might be a bit wary about buying it. So I think there is likely to be that effect, but I think the main thing is just going to be a fall in the value of the properties that are affected by the tax.
And can I come in there briefly again? Sorry, just to add on that. I think sometimes people get a little bit confused by this and think that this capitalization effect, this price effect, means it's a double whammy from these taxes, that basically I'm paying more and my property value has gone down. I face a double whammy. But that's not really true. In effect, what happens is, as you occupy the property, you face a higher bill. But actually, it's at the point of sale, you no longer face that higher bill. You'd face that kind of that sort of change in property value. And if you sell the property, 4 or 5 years down the line, in today's terms, that reduction in sales value is less because it's happening, 4 or 5 years down the line. So it's not a double whammy. But what it does mean, though, is it's not the occupiers of these properties that sort of, face the higher bill. It is not even the future owners of the properties that face the higher bill. It's the current owners now, because either the current owners now, they'll be either paying a higher bill until they move, or when they sell, then the value is lower at that point. And then the future owners and occupiers, they just pay a lower price for that property, which offsets the higher bill they have to pay in future. So it's not a double whammy, but it does mean it's a tax on the current owners of the property, not the future owners of the property.
Great, thank you. Some great economics there. So there's a whole bunch of questions here that I'll just take all together, where the common theme is, what could the government do to improve the supply side, to improve growth, improve productivity? So I think one big picture thing to say is that there is no growth lever in the Treasury. There's no magic thing. There's no one thing you can do that just makes this problem go away. If there were, they would have found that. You have to do the hard yards across lots of different policy areas. And there's lots of policy levers available here, everything from regulation and competition policy and employment policy, things like education policy we haven't talked about today, but actually getting that right and making sure that people have the right skills, that employers and potential and future employees know what the system they're going through looks like, that we're investing in the right thing. So it really is about having good policy in lots of areas. On tax, just to take the area we talked about most today, I think one mistake people often make is to think the government needs to do more. to get growth. You need to incentivize something. You had new reliefs or new incentives. Actually, I think a lot of what we need to do is step back. The government is doing a lot of things that disincentivizes behavior. It disincentivizes investment in lots of ways. It disincentivizes risk taking. It incentivizes people to change their legal form, not for the best commercial purposes, but for tax planning purposes. It does more to discourage saving than it needs to. It does more to discourage labour supply than it needs to. Not that you can stop all of those things. Some of them are trade-offs between you want to raise some money and you have to have some distortions. But we have more distortions than are necessary that in order to raise the kinds of revenues we want and achieve the kind of redistributive aims that we want to do. So we have written literally thousands and thousands of pages over the years on what that means in practice. But I think it's about, for any tax you pick, there are problems with that tax. You can go and you can fix it. And to pick one example that Isaac talked about, we have now disincentivized saving and investment by putting up some tax rates. Actually, if we had done the tax rate increases alongside actually changing the definition of the tax base so it's less disincentivizing, that wouldn't have magically on its own affected growth. But if we had that more dogmatic, every term we'll just keep chipping away at this, we'll keep making things better, then I think you would start to see the dial move. Another thing I think worth saying in passing on this topic is that we shouldn't over-calibrate to what gets scored in the OBR. Obviously, every chancellor wants something big enough to be scored, but there'll be lots of good measures that aren't big enough to be scored in the OBR. But again, if you do enough of them and you consistently keep doing them, then I think you'd start to see some effects. And what we saw yesterday, the disappointment wasn't just that the OBR wasn't scoring some of these measures, there weren't really any measures there that were in the ilk of making things better. Let's take some more questions. I'm trying to do some quick fire questions to try to get through some more of these. So there's a different question here. So on levies on international student fees, so I'm going to call on somebody on the Zoom call to jump in here. With a set levy on international students instead of a percentage of fees, will universities simply increase fees and transfer the burden onto students? A question here about student fees. Who wants to jump in on that? I'm trying to look at my list of who I've got on the call.
Hello, that's me.
Oh,
Can you hear me, Helen?
I can. Hello, Kate. Lovely. Thank you.
Right, yeah. So we had expected a levy on the tuition fees paid by international students. We thought that would be a 6% levy, so 6% of the fees they pay. Instead, the government's now proposing a £925 flat fee per student from 2028 only, so not straight away. And that will not apply for the first 220 students at any single provider. So this means some small specialist arts providers like the Royal Academy of Music will be taken totally out of this paying this levy. Whether that gets passed through into tuition fees will depend on the relative elasticity of supply and demand for international student places. The government assesses some of it will likely be passed through in the form of higher fees, but we will still see a decline in international student numbers. So partial pass-through was the government's assessment.
Great, thank you. A bunch of questions. People get very excited about EV taxes. So maybe Isaac, I'll come to you first. Maybe we can bring Stuart in if we want to. So one practical question about how would the new EV road tax be collected? And more broadly, how could motoring taxes be targeted at congestion? Is there a simple way to do that other than creating more congestion charging zones?
Yeah, great question. So on the first question of how is this new tax per mile going to be collected, the simple answer is that it's going to be collected basically when you go for your MOT. They're going to check how far you've driven, but actually at the beginning of a given year, you're going to estimate how much you're going to drive in that year. You'll pay the tax on that estimate. When it comes to your MOT, they'll check how far you've actually driven and they'll sort of correct how much you paid as a result. So that's basically how it works. There's also, when you buy a new car, as most people will know, you don't have an MOT for the first 3 years. So there's a new process being sort of dreamed up with the DVLA being involved, and they're going to check your mileage in those years. So there are some sort of plans in place as to how this is actually going to work in practice. I've completely forgotten what the second part of the question was, Helen.
Is there another way to more simply do it? If you want to do a broad congestion charging,
oh yeah.
Do we have to do more zones, or can we do a road pricing?
The thing about congestion is that basically the costs vary a lot depending on when you're driving and where you're driving. So you really need a tax that varies on that basis. So you could imagine some technological solutions that would allow, road pricing, for instance, to vary on when roads are particularly busy, particular times, particular places when they're busy. And that would be like really the ideal solution. This kind of tax where you just tax per mile, as you were saying before, it really doesn't work that well because there are a lot of miles driven that really just don't incur any congestion and aren't imposing costs on anyone. And so taxing them really isn't correcting for the externality that you're really trying to target.
Great. So we're almost at time. Let me take one, maybe two, but one more question. Is this spend now, pay later budget an indictment of Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules using a rolling 3-year forecast period to cut borrowing? I think it's the main part of the question, how urgent is balancing the books in the now to fix the public purse? Why don't I take that? I mean, it's worth saying that part of what happened here was that Rachel Reeves was faced with bigger spending pressures. It's not necessarily the case that you want to adjust immediately to that and raise taxes to quickly offset those, in year. If spending pressures arise, it makes sense to kind of consolidate towards sorting those out, either by bringing them down or by raising taxes. So to some degree, taking a little bit of time to adjust makes sense. But what Rachel Reeves also chose to do was to do more discretionary spending, to increase spending more in the short run and to delay some of the paying for that. In big picture, no, in some sense, no, it doesn't matter that we balance the books today. There's nothing that says we have to do that. But if we have a plan to balance the books, at some point we need to get to that point. And the danger is that we're always hoping that it'll be in 3 years' time. There's a cracking chart that the OBR created a while ago showing government's plans for, in this case, getting the debt down. And we're always promising that we're about to get the debt down. We never actually pull it off. So what matters for the public finances is not so much what's happening exactly this year, or even what the government says will happen in 3 years. It's what's real matter will what actually happens in 3 years. And at some point, getting the fiscal house in order does mean that revenues are, paying for day-to-day spending, and that debt genuinely is coming down, not just in the way that you have to squint to see on a chart, but actually is meaningfully coming down. And we should bear that in mind when we think about all these forecast changes from March and between March and now. That's not what really matters. What really matters is that underlying picture. We need higher growth, higher living standards, and we need to keep focusing on that. But since we're at time, let me say thank you again to all of my fabulous and very tired colleagues. Thank you to everyone who's sent in questions, and hopefully we won't see you for a big one of these in spring. We'll all be better slept in spring. But we look forward to seeing you at another IFS event soon. Thank you very much.